Okay, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Holy Father, we thank you that we can consider this subject tonight, and we pray that you will bless us and prepare our way to have a fertile study uh, on several Fridays going with this. Lord, help us not to get so bogged down in the science that we don't hear the theology. Help us not to get so bogged down in theology that we don't pay attention to the science. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so I'm indebted to Christopher Watkins' biblical critical theory for reminding me of that film. I actually showed the clip while we were waiting for this to start, but you can see the thing on there. It's a 1927 German film by Fritz Lang, and he was alarmed by the dehumanization that was taking place in the Germany of the time because of the rapid pace of industrial expansion. So he created a classic science fiction film called Metropolis. It's a silent film, and it's most well known for a rather attractive female robot. But there's this real powerful metaphor in the one scene where the boilers of this industrial plant that you see on the left are overheating for the sake of increased productivity, and workers are already, fatigued and passing out from the heat. And then at a critical point, the industrial plant actually transforms, at least in the eyes of the protagonist and on the screen, transforms into the Near Eastern god Moloch or Moloch, the idol that had the furnace as a belly in which the worshipers would pitch their children. And in this case, it's the factory workers that are being sacrificed to the factory in order to throw the bodies in and cool the boilers down so that the factory can keep on working. So essentially, the factory workers are being sacrificed to the factory in the name of efficiency. And that's why I gave you the quotation from Watkin in the handout, where he said, but in an ironic twist, the God is nothing but efficiency itself, a means in ends clothing. Nothing is to be enjoyed. Everything is to be exploited and maximized. And enjoyment itself is then co-opted into this ethic of maximization as something to be exploited and monetized in turn. And then he makes the connection between the fact that in this case, the workers and some of the population are being sacrificed to the Moloch of the factory in order for efficiency. And then he goes on to say that AI, its whole purpose is exploitation and monetization, and whole populations and global welfare itself is being sacrificed into the belly of artificial intelligence. But before we get into the background on artificial intelligence in particular, let's discuss our survey. And so and I hope you saw the handout. If you don't, I'm at least going to read the questions before everybody answers on this. But these are self-explanatory questions, but the answer I'm looking for is yes if you have no reservations about it, and sometimes if you think it might be okay sometimes as a tool, but you still have some reservations about it, and no if you think it's absolutely unethical to do. So the first question was, is it ethical to use AI to facilitate graphic design work? Waylene says no. Dominic says yes. Linda, Camelia, Chi say yes. Was that Philip answering?
Oh, I didn't answer.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, you can answer now. Uh,
Sometimes I say,
sometimes. Yeah. Uh, well, I better say sometimes because it wasn't that long ago that I used AI to create the background for the worship slides. And it came out pretty well. But why would I say sometimes is because the way AI works is it searches databases of information, sometimes pixel by pixel, and it looks for things that it can use to solve the problem that it's been given. And then it creates its material. And the problem with using AI in graphic design work is that it may steal the work of an artist without acknowledgement and incorporate it into what you're trying to do. So that, whereas the artist would normally make some money out of a royalty, or the artist would at least get some kind of a credit, essentially the AI is stealing from the artist. So artists are very much up in arms about the use of AI art. And so what I would say is I think it may be okay to use it, but we better be careful how we use it. Um, and I was just using it for stylized question marks, so I don't think any artists were harmed in the making of the church slides. But that just shows you how AI questions are not always straightforward.
No, no.
And so that's why I said something.
Says yes. It's just another design, which I think what is better or worse than what the artist did in the beholder's eye. So it's just another design which is compared with so-called best designer. Sometimes
are you using the microphone for the people there? Because I cannot
Well,
hear it.
um, yeah, what Dominic said, the reason he said is yes, is because he says it's just another design, and whether it is better or whether it's worse than what the artist intended is in the eye of the beholder. So I think that's possible, and I think sometimes artists do overreact. I remember when we sold our novels to audiobooks that some of the authors in that series were upset because Hasbro sold the rights without asking us. I'm happy because I get a check every so often without having to do any extra work. So the royalties are nice, but artists sometimes overreact. Okay, number two, is it ethical to use AI to simplify customer service questions and transactional procedures?
mm-hmm.
Linda says yes. Camelia says yes.
Mm-hmm.
She says yes.
Yes.
Philip says yes. Okay.
I, uh, um,
Is Dominic going to be contrarian on this one? Waylene just simply says, I want a person.
I it's hard to say because it could steal jobs away.
Well, it can steal jobs away. Any type of automation, robotics, and digitization, such like, can steal jobs away. However, history teaches us that when technology steals jobs, it usually creates new jobs. For example, back in the late 50s and early 60s, one of the really good jobs for a person that wasn't college educated was switchboard operator. The switchboard operator, would physically plug, cables in to connect numbers. And all of those, lost their jobs by the end of the 60s. But what happened is that the same automation, for the phone company that took out all of those switchboard operators ended up creating additional jobs. And those additional jobs were sometimes installation jobs, sometimes customer service jobs, sometimes billing jobs, and such like. But phones proliferated significantly more after the age of switchboards was gone, and people could get their own multi-line hookups on their consoles, and so jobs actually ended up proliferating. Computers were supposed to take away jobs, but I'm certainly thankful that part of my career was tied to computers, because who would have ever thought that you could use televisions and computers to play games on? As Ralph Baer, the father of video games, said, during the Cold War, the early 50s, when he was working for a television company and using a calibrator to adjust screens, and said, this would be a cool toy, for kids to play with, and it could even have an educational thing. His boss told him to shut up and get to work. That's the stupidest thing he ever heard. And then later, when he was at Magnavox, he was able to create the Odyssey and video games, and Pong was a direct ripoff of the Odyssey. So, it went from there. So innovation does have a tendency to create new jobs. Sometimes they require retraining and re-education and such like. But anyway, I think the problem with the automation of customer service and transactional procedures is that it is hard to get to a human when they rely so much on it. On a thing where a human could have answered me inside of a few minutes, there have been times when it took me an hour to get to the human because of all of the AI stuff. So it may not be unethical, but it's annoying.
So the answer is no? Yes?
Well, I don't know that there's any real answers here. I mean, these are, what is your opinion? And what I was saying is, I don't know that it's unethical, but I know that personally I find it very, very annoying. But I do have a definite.
I'm sorry. It's just because the AI is not intelligent enough.
Yes.
Yeah. But if it gets too intelligent, it may be able to sabotage your finances. And if it gets too intelligent, it may be just, taking payments before you're ready. Much like the automated pharmacy service that Walgreens uses, that's always trying to renew my prescriptions, not my subscriptions, my prescriptions, always trying to renew my prescriptions before the insurance is ready to pay for it, because they keep, trying to do it earlier and earlier. So in that sense, it can be somewhat damaging, but not irreversibly so. But yes, you're exactly right. It's because the artificial intelligence is still too artificial. Number 3, is it ethical to use AI to analyze potential job prospects and submit hiring recommendations? I hear 2 no's already from Waylene and Linda.
I say sometimes.
Sometimes. What did you say, Philip?
Sometimes.
Philip said sometimes. We're getting a consensus here. Dominic says sometimes.
Just, you can look it's one of the judgment.
Dominic says you can't use it exclusively, but you could use it as one of the judgment tools. And I agree. The problem with using it exclusively is that it could easily have a biased data set, and it could also have a biased set of assumptions that is invisible to the main user. For example, if you use one of these online sites, I've forgotten the names of some of them now, but anyway, online site to help you with job search, and it gives you the recommendation, and you just take that at face value, and you don't know what their algorithm is, then basically you may be excluding a whole lot of people who might be qualified.
I think you can generalize it to something even more important. I think which Dr. Wong may be interested in. Is it ethical to use AI to make diagnostic decisions? Of course,
They're using microphones. Do you have microphones for them?
I don't have a microphone for them, but he was talking about you, and he was asking, is it ethical to use AI to make a diagnostic decision exclusively?
Well, the problem is then, can you sue the AI if the diagnosis is wrong? you know, who do you sue? We can sue doctors all the time. I mean, doctors get sued all the time if they made the wrong diagnosis. But if AI made the diagnosis, I think the AI has to be at least checked by the human doctor, so the human doctor will be the one liable. Okay.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
But if the human doctors get lazy,
right?
Like for example, I know of pastors who get their sermons off of the internet, download them, and print them. Now, I don't think it would necessarily be bad to read sermons from off the internet. After all, I read sermons in books all the time, and sometimes I listen to sermons. But I don't think that's unethical. But I think when you're taking it whole cloth without doing your own work, without really interacting with what God is trying to tell you from the text, then I think you've done a disservice, and it's unethical. Well, I know of pastors who do that just with downloadable sermons. What happens when they can go to Chat GPT-4 or DeepSeek and say, I'm preaching through Isaiah, and I don't know what to do with Isaiah 44, so give me a sermon for Isaiah 44. And all of a sudden, Chat GPT-4 gives them a sermon, and Chat GPT-4 can give them a sermon. But you don't know, if it's from a Mormon, if they're using a Mormon database or Jehovah's Witnesses or whatever. I mean, basically, an AI is only as good as the data set that it's using. And like I'm going to say later in the presentation, we get back to the old GIGO acronym.
Just to interject about the diagnosis and doctors and AI, there's been studies that show the AI is better than the average doctor. Okay, in a lot of things. Okay, but that just means, it can be the AI can be better than the average preacher. The AI could be better than the average whatever, but the average is not what we will look for. We shouldn't be looking for the average doctor or the average preacher if the average is not so good, because I think the average doctor is no good,
Yeah. Yeah. Why go to Yelp and say, I'm only considering those things that are average? I don't want the excellent ones. So I don't know that there's a medical Yelp, but anyway, in that sense. Is it ethical to use AI to analyze personal data and submit recommendations for loans? I'm hearing a lot of no's here. I hear sometimes.
I still say sometimes.
Philip says sometimes. I actually have to say the thing I worry about here is if they're analyzing personal data, the AI has access to the personal data,
Mhm.
and who knows what happens in the future. For example, if they were using DeepSeek to process loans, that means financial data for US citizens is going to communist China. That may be happening through TikTok and other stuff anyway, but but DeepSeek, that means China's getting our data. So, we we have to be careful as to what the AI is doing. What are you submitting?
Yeah.
Is it a closed system?
They don't have to learn anymore.
Camellia says, AI would have a tendency to make people lazy. They wouldn't have to learn anymore. And that's exactly right.
That's true
It is happening in schools. It's happening in jobs and the like.
It's happening with Elon Musk.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And actually, one of the things is that the department that he was appointed to has access
Mhm.
to all of our personal data. So the question is, what's happening with that? And, we certainly don't have a lot of confidence in it, considering the way the firings have gone. He's gotten some. He's gotten some, and who's going to stop him from it? A judge stopped him from some, but not from the rest.
But the thing, yeah, it's not, but it's not just artificial intelligence or human. It's, the judge may not be able to enforce anything because they are talking about this issue now. How can the judge enforce things on the president? The president, I mean, the Supreme Court cannot send, any enforcement agencies. That is their issue now. Has nothing to do with artificial intelligence.
But even if the judge had enforcement rights that are clear, how do you do it if it's an AI? And remember, Elon Musk knows people who are expert in this area, so the AI would be able to do whatever they want to do without anybody interrupting, because that's one of the dangers of AI. If you don't know the parameters, you don't know what to do. So enforcement on fraud is going to be significantly harder. Everything gets harder. So it's just like everything else in technology. The easier it becomes, the more difficult ramifications there are. But we're going to talk about how that's even in the Bible. But so we can go on. I'm afraid if I go all the way through all of these, that it's going to take too long. However, I want to see what you have to say. So please fill them out and get them to me by email or later tonight. So we'll go on. Interestingly enough, sort of related to this is an understanding about what the goal is for AI. And the goal from a lot of people is what is known as general intelligence or technological singularity, or AGI, artificial general intelligence, which is supposed to be being able to think humanly as well or better than a human being. This is the late Werner Vinge on the left, who was a computer scientist and a science fiction writer in his own right. And Vinge is quoted as saying that we can, in the, actually, I need to move that so the folks here can actually see it. We can, in the fairly near future, create or become creatures who surpass humans in every intellectual and creative dimension. Now, some theorists call the singularity the creation of an artificial personality that's so real that if you were interacting with it and you couldn't see it, you would think that it was human.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there was a movie about a decade or so ago called Her, and it was about the singularity. And in this case, the human user, who was admittedly a computer nerd, falls in love with the artificial person. And eventually, spoiler alert, gets dumped by her when she evolves onward. Yeah, sure, it's science fiction, but it points to the desire to create, indeed, for humanity to play God. And so we're going to come back to that later. Right now, I told you that there are pastors who have surprising ideas. So here's what pastors said about using AI in a January 2024 survey from Barna, which, as you know, is a very neutral group. So 88% of them were like you guys. They, assisting in graphic design, it's fine. And assisting with marketing and marketing materials, fine. Tracking church attendance and engagement, they began to have questions because what information is being used where? And for communication, if you're using AI to communicate on behalf of your church, where is it getting its information and what is it really sending out there? Or organizing and prioritizing church tasks. Is the AI better at this than your board? Sermon research and preparation. Almost half said it's okay, but I'm hoping that half is like Philip was talking about with the diagnosis. Yeah, sure, but it's only part of it. It's only a tool. The same with church budget planning. Then creating study materials for your congregants. Yeah, I mean, theoretically, I could take a bunch of articles and slam them into Acrobat and use the Acrobat AI to create materials for our study group. How many of you want to hold your breath till that happens? That's not my style. It's not my. Well, I think it's wrong if that's all you're doing.
Oh,
Yeah.
If that's all that.
Yeah.
But I'm hoping that's all they got to do. I mean,
well, hopefully. Yeah.
I'm not.
Well, hopefully you're not talking about me, because Waylene says I do too much research. So.
Don't you just say first. It's prejudice to do everything.
Yeah.
Same as using AI.
Right. So Dominic said it's the same as using a person that has a bias to do everything. Writing professional communication or correspondence. Yeah, I still think you have to be careful. And I can tell you this, I hate the fact that every time I try to write an email, Copilot pops up and tries to help me. So anyway, but that's personal preference. That's not necessarily ethics. Creating learning experiences for children. I've got more reservations once you get AI involved with children. Reviewing applications, I've already told you I have reservations about that. sermon writing, fortunately, a low percentage here, but I understand it's getting higher. This was 2024. And counseling, absolutely. Counseling should be a red flag. And in the same survey, they asked what impact will AI have on relationships? And pastors, 5% of them said AI is going to be positive. And in the overall population of US adults, 21% said it's going to be positive. Now, 56% of pastors, largely being a lot of Luddites, but anyway, said it was going to be negative. But the truth is, I think there are going to be a lot of negatives. I would probably be in the 38% neutral because I think there's some good and some bad. But let me tell you from my computer game experience that in England, there was a divorce. And the wife divorced her husband on the grounds of incompatibility because of adultery. He had an affair on Second Life. A woman in America had a character on Second Life, and he had a character on Second Life. The Second Life is a virtual world, where you can, dress up your avatars, and you can go to various places. You could,
Imaginary?
It's a virtual world, so it's like a game, except it doesn't really have any game rules. It's like a game. But anyway, she divorced him because she said he was having an affair with this woman, because she said, his affection and his attention was all going to this virtual woman.
Well, it's like, you'll go to you.
Can't hear all the interesting interactions. Yeah.
Yeah. So Linda was agreeing with the woman and saying that people who play too many computer games, so and then she's patting Waylene on the shoulder, like, go for it, get rid of this sucker.
No.
So it's no longer science fiction. It's reality now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just heard something on BBC that they have affairs so with the AI person. Okay. And then get them now. So.
In Japan, there is a trend of dating your AI significant other and actually making reservations at restaurants, and even ordering for the digital girlfriend.
I think this guy had no chance. I know what
all I can say is, it happens. Well, what I have to say is that can't be good for relationships. The chances of finding a real girlfriend if you're taking your iPad out,
Happy dinner.
Yeah.
No. It's a romance.
Well, Waylene does call my Surface my mistress.
I mean, it's between you and your spouse. I mean, not AI.
Yeah.
To me, it's imaginary.
I still take her out, but sometimes the mistress goes along. But yeah, so that's so meanwhile, what we're saying is that the AI can have an impact on relationships. I don't see how it can have a positive impact per se, because in general, the AI is going to be phony interaction. You know, what if I had the AI writing love poetry for Waylene? I don't write it that often, but I would feel it was dishonest. And so I think there's a problem. But the big problem with AI, and where we're going to focus on it tonight, is the idea is for humanity to create something that does two things. One, extends the life of their personality and physicality, and two, surpasses the humanity for which we were created. So let's actually, do you remember the sin in the Garden of Eden narrative? It wasn't, as some people say, the seeking of knowledge, because they stopped short and they called it the tree of knowledge. But it isn't. It was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Good and evil, right and wrong. And it wasn't really for the purpose of knowing what to do right. Remember, the temptation was the serpent's suggestion that they would be like God. Sin is always about playing God. But you say, these scientists don't really want to be God. Yet the transhuman movement, in the sense of becoming more than human, is strictly about that. The manifesto of the transhuman movement is called Homo Deus, which is Latin for human God. Homo Deus, a brief history of tomorrow. And it proclaims the goal as transcending the problem of human death by technological means. As the serpent said, you shall not surely die. And B, to enhance human happiness by reducing pain and weakness by both bioengineering and cyborg engineering, to merge human with technology and, quote, create gods, end quote. So being a science fiction fan, when I think about the process, my first inclination is to say, well, what's wrong with that? Because we already replace amputated legs, implant artificial lenses in eyes, and transplant organs, and change out worn out body parts in hip and knee surgeries, and do 3D print replacement valves for internal organs. Aren't those good things? Yes. But the book about transhumanism is called Homo Deus. The idea is live forever by technological means. And the problem is, if that succeeds, it means keeping humans alive forever without solving the sin problem. So it would essentially be consigning people to what would ultimately be a form of hell, because we would never get the perfection that God intends for us. And for us Christians, as a matter of fact, the only Homo Deus was Jesus. And trying to usurp his position is frankly idolatry. So I find myself in agreement with a concept from Neil Postman's Technopoly, 2019, where he asserts that new technologies alter the structure of our interests, the things we think about. They alter the character of our symbols, the things we think with. and they alter the nature of community, the arena in which thoughts develop, end quote. So if you had time to look at the text I gave you in the handout from Genesis 4, you may have noticed that all the technological advancements didn't work out too well. So let's look at those answers. Since these are the descendants of Cain, and things seem to be getting, and as we know from the flood narrative, they do get worse, we could easily use this text as a diatribe against all technology, urbanization, the arts, and technology. But God's approval and disapproval doesn't come about as a result of what they make as much as why they make it. So, in Genesis 4:17, what is the name of the first city named in the Bible? Enoch, yeah. Who built it and who's it named after? Uh-oh. I must have misread it. I was thinking that Enoch built it himself.
It says
Was it
Cain.
Cain?
Yeah,
It was Cain? Okay. Well, just shows how carelessly I read that. Okay.
So the AI would.
Yeah. That's what I get for using AI. No, this was DI. It was dumb intelligence. Or CI, careless intelligence.
So what you trying to ask then?
Well, because it was named after them, I was saying that it was ego, it was egotistical and such like. Now, the next two are much more pertinent than that one. So let's go to Genesis 4:21. Jubal is the ancestor, so apparently the first of his kind in doing what? Musicianship, yeah. He was the first to play the pipe and lyre. So since this is an evil family, is this saying that music is evil?
No. When it first started. Because that's human being. It's every time you change the norm or invented something out of ordinary, it's always negative.
Okay, so Linda says anytime you go out of the norm, it's negative, and so at the beginning, musicianship was evil. In a way, she's right, because the first song that is recorded in the Bible is right here in this passage, and this song is a taunt song from Lamech, where he said, "Yeah, Cain will be avenged for his death 7 times. Mess with me, and you're going to die 70 times." So it was a taunt song to go after his enemy. So, basically, if you think, rap songs that advocate drug and violence and murder and sex are evil, yes, then this one's evil too. And it just goes to show that even, back in the introduction of music could be warped. And yet we know music that can lead you to worship. And we know music that can put you in touch with God. And we know music where God speaks through the music as well as the lyrics to lift up our souls. So music in itself is not evil, but music can have evil consequences.
If they are made by evil people, and all the descendants of Cain came from the evil Cain, so the evil people. If people is evil, it's not the music is evil. I mean,
right?
The musicians were evil.
It was what they used it for. Yes, right. And evidently they used it much like a lot of rap songs today. Or some of the country songs and rock songs that glorify sinful behavior, drugs and sex and the like, and violence. So once again, I think what we see is a technology that has potential for good when God redeems it, but it starts off as evil. So it's a lot like the Christmas Carol. What child is this? What child is this celebrates Mary's virginity, the virgin birth of Christ, and the Christ child? But the tune was originally written about a prostitute who followed the army, and her name was Greensleeves because instead of like going to a hotel or a motel, basically she just leaned back in the grass following the camp, and so she had green sleeves. So the hymn starts off, with an evil beginning, and then it ends up with lyrics and redeemed, so that I think it sounds very worshipful, even though I know the history of the song and probably ruined it for some of you. But nonetheless, it's an illustration of music is neutral. It can either be blessed by God or it can be damned by sinful humanity.
Just related this to those that attend the Chinese services. Pastor John Chow always criticized the hymns that are theologically wrong, even though they're so-called hymns. Okay, so even hymns can be used wrongly.
Yes. In Genesis 4:22, who is the person who is associated with crafting from bronze and iron? The first metallurgist. Tubal-Cain. Yes. Yep. Tubal-Cain is the one. And this is interesting because in Tubal-Cain's time, they aren't doing iron. This is projected back and saying he's the father of metallurgy. So basically, he's responsible for bronze and iron. But what was the major use of bronze and iron? Weapons. When we say Bronze Age, we're talking about bronze shields and swords. When we talk about Iron Age, we're talking about iron shields and swords. Now, yes, iron had peaceful uses too. Used for agriculture, used for manufacturing, used. I don't know how much cooking they were doing with iron then. Well, basically, they used a lot of pottery then. So.
Now we are talking about steel and then tariffs of steel.
Yes, exactly. So, yeah. So anyway, once again, the technology itself is neutral. It's what you use it for. And unfortunately, if it isn't being directed by God, a lot of times technology ends up being distorted. For example, this is so old, most of you have not seen it, but there was an old movie called 2001: A Space Odyssey, which came out in the 60s when I was in high school. So the opening sequence was a bunch of ape-like creatures who saw this monolith. And this monolith represented knowledge. It represented ascension. And immediately after, these creatures come around the monolith and begin to worship the monolith. Then these creatures discover that bones can be used as tools. But it's only a minor step before they're using the bones that became the tools as weapons. And what was the music that was underscoring this sequence? The Richard Strauss song, Also sprach Zarathustra. It's the one that goes, bum, 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 bum. Yeah, that's it. And that literally means, thus spoke Zarathustra, the Zoroastrian, the Persian prophet who spoke the words of the Persian deity Ahura Mazda. So the monolith represents knowledge that is used in a pagan religion that becomes twisted from tool to weapon. But let's not strictly deal with science fiction metaphors. Let's consider historical precedent. Did you know that during the Manhattan Project, that was recently dramatized in the movie Oppenheimer, did you know that there was a time when they realized absolutely definitely that Germany did not have the bomb? Now, if you follow history, you know that this was largely due to Werner Heisenberg dragging his feet by constantly directing his associates to follow the most difficult path in trying to create atomic material for the explosive material. But the one scene they didn't put in Oppenheimer that they should have was an actual conversation that took place between Major Furman, the military liaison between the project and the Pentagon, and Dr. Samuel Goldschmidt, who was one of the scientists on the project. By the way, in our Bible study in Bellevue, we had a former member of the Manhattan Project, and he was so horrified by what they had done that he would never talk about it. But anyway, Goldschmidt was overjoyed because Germany didn't have the bomb, and he said, "Isn't it wonderful? The Germans have no atom bomb. Now we won't have to use ours." And Major Furman said, "Of course you understand, Sam. If we have such a weapon, we are going to use it." So let me quote a source I used when I was crafting that 1973 paper I talked about. At the moment when a scientist or any other person perceives that a given scientific discovery has a human application, certain inescapable questions arise: on whom and under what conditions shall this discovery be used, and to what kinds of social goals should it be instrumental? So we'll come back to this article when we get to genetic engineering and nanomachines, later in the study. Not tonight, but later in the study in another Friday night. But I just wanted to introduce that idea because culture and technology magnify and they refine the human capacity for both good and evil. But they predispose us to one or the other. Technology is good. It can even be a gift of God. But the problem is, it can either be a gift of God or it becomes a God in itself. And it seduces the wielders of technology to presume their own godhood. Worse, technology can be sifted down to the idea of efficiency. But efficiency is a means, not an end. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. So listen to what the author of Homo Deus said about data religion. He wrote, "Data religion believes that the entire universe is a flow of data, that organisms are algorithms, and that humans' cosmic vocation is to create an all-encompassing data processing system and then merge into it. End quote. Now, that's scary. That's frightening because we don't really know what we're going to create. Now, I know I'm going to run a little bit late, but just let me share a simple part of the problem. Now, this is very, very basic. We're going to talk narrow AI. So I'm going to use the illustration of a robot. Now, we've used robots in manufacturing for decades. But instead of being humanoid, they were more like the robot bartenders on a Royal Caribbean cruise. Now, we walked by these, on our way to dinner every night. And what I noticed was a lot of times they were inactive because they had to be recalibrated. They weren't really, in that good a shape. It seemed like they were out of service as much as they were working. But it was interesting to see them mix and serve a drink. But it was as a novelty. And it really wouldn't be a long-term replacement for human servers. Now, robots with that kind of AI would be called narrow AI. But the goal that theorists are working on, the goal that DeepSeek uses with the cheaper NVIDIA chips, and the goal that Microsoft and OpenAI and the like are using with the most advanced NVIDIA chips is to create artificial general intelligence. That first conference internationally on trying to do that was in 2008. And the stated goal was creating self-improving artificial intelligence. Okay, so here is an image of a humanoid robot that learned how to make coffee from watching videos. Now, that's impressive. It learned, it improved, but it isn't quite versatile enough to become a barista and replace a minimum wage worker at Starbucks. So I want to bring that up to illustrate the basic problem with AI, which is literal instructions. For example, let's say a human named Harriet has stopped at a gas station in the middle of the desert. She has her humanoid robot, Robbie, with her, and she sends Robbie the robot to fetch coffee. But the gas station is out of coffee. So Robbie trundles off at 3 miles per hour to the nearest town, 200 miles away, returns 10 days later with the desiccated remains of a cup of coffee, while Harriet, waiting patiently, has been well supplied with iced tea and Coca-Cola by the gas station owner. Now, if Robbie were human, or even a well-designed AI robot, he wouldn't interpret Harriet's command quite so literally. I have to get coffee. There is no coffee here. Therefore, I will go to the nearest coffee, even though the coffee is not going to be any good by the time I get back. I'm going to do that. So the command cannot be a goal to be achieved at all costs. It has to be a way of conveying Harriet's preferences, but inducing Robbie to adapt if there is no coffee. If Harriet prefers coffee to no coffee, all other things being equal, how do you communicate to the robot that all things are not equal? So it means if Robbie has a way to get coffee without changing anything else about the world, then it might be a good thing to do, even if he doesn't understand anything else that Harriet is doing. So This example builds on the idea of coding with explicit code rules, but machine learning, what we call AI today, wants you to learn from examples and define fixed patterns and make predictions and improve its own performance. But now, multiply that robot illustration I just gave by the idea of self-correcting machines. A very early pioneer in automation named Norbert Wiener was very cautious about turning tasks over to machines and algorithms because he said, if we use to achieve our purposes a mechanical agency with whose operation we cannot interfere, then we better make sure that the purpose put into the machine is the purpose we really desire. Did Harriet really desire for that robot to go 200 miles and cause her to wait 10 days? Absolutely not. So being able to not interrupt Robbie's functions certainly was a disadvantage in our example. So that's precisely what we're doing when we develop self-correcting or self-modifying entities. In my classes, I used to describe artificial intelligence with self-correction as being a lot like a computer virus. Now, computer viruses are often distributed by means of a worm, a self-contained computer program that spreads through a computer network by finding the security holes in the computers that are connected to the network. So in 2003, there was a very famous worm called the blaster worm that infected a lot of computers that ran Windows and would end up giving them the blue screen of death. In fact, here's some of the code from the blaster worm there on the screen. The solution? A benevolent hacker created another worm. This one was called Nachi A. Nachi A appeared and it took advantage of the same backdoors in the computers on the network as the blaster worm had used. The Nachi A worm found and destroyed copies of the blaster worm, destroyed the blaster worm, and fixed the security problem that allowed it access in the first place. Wonderful. Self-correcting. Was this a good thing? Well, Nachi A uses two files. You've probably seen them on your own computer. DLL host exec and SVC host exec. Those are general files that are used in Windows all the time. And then they created the services RPC patch and RPC TFPD as network connections sharing. If you have RPC patches showing up, you might have a virus on your computer. So the worm then scans the network for computers on which it can execute exploits. In this case, it removed Blaster A. It created an antivirus. Woohoo, fixed things. And lest you think it was going to hang around malevolently and do something bad in the future, it removed itself after January 1st of 2004. Good. Unfortunately, it exploits computers on the network, which meant that it inadvertently affected Diebold ATM machines, shutting them down throughout the country and affecting monetary transactions until the IT guys from the banks could find them and fix them. So it was a good thing, but it had this inadvertent side effect. This is the problem with self-correcting code. Sometimes it can do inadvertent stuff, and it's the inadvertent effect that causes the trouble. So from a Christian perspective, we truly have to consider if we're creating a tool or trying to be gods. And trying to be gods doesn't work so well. We've already mentioned the Garden of Eden, but I would be remiss not to think about Genesis 11. Genesis 11, the structure was whole earth, one language, words the like. The result of the experience at the end of verse 9 is God confused the language of all the earth. It was counterproductive, whatever happened in chapter 11. Now we know what happened was they said, let us make bricks, build a city and a tower to the heavens, make a name for ourselves, and be secure. In other words, we don't really need God. We're going to build ourselves up there, and we're going to be equal to him. Much like the cosmonaut, when I was very young, who goes into, orbit and says, I did not see God. Very literal idea of the heavens, but a similar situation, the arrogance. Of course, God then says, let us go down and confuse, and he scattered them abroad. And of course, the centerpiece is always the important part when we see these envelope structures. Yahweh came down. So they said, let us, and God as three in one, as well as God with all his heavenly servants, says, let us go down and confuse. So the momentum swing as they built their ziggurat is they said, let's go up into the heavens. And God has to come down to look at them. Let us, let us. By the way, we don't have time to go into this, but this is a tablet from the Enuma Elish, and it has a similar story from the old Babylonian. So Christians need to be careful about the assumptions regarding AI. So how can damage be done with AI? Why are we worried about it? Well, the most obvious thing is through misunderstandings. My only published movie review was the 1983 film War Games. You probably don't even recognize a young Matthew Broderick there. Yeah, War Games. In this film, a teenage computer addict, look at that crazy printer over there printing in calculator tapes as opposed to pages. Anyway, this computer addict uses an acoustic modem and a coupler and a dial-up modem to hack into what he thinks is a video game company's database. But it turns out to be a government project where they were training a computer to be able to make strategic decisions in the case of a global war. So he plays a simulated version of global thermonuclear war and ends up almost starting World War III. And spoiler alert, the way they avoid the war is they make the computer play tic-tac-toe, tic-tac-toe, tic-tac-toe over and over and over again until it realizes that zero-sum games are unreliable. It's a lesson that some politicians and corporate executives need to learn today with their destructive winner-take-all attitudes. So perhaps closer to home, hospitals such as the Mayo Clinic, the UCLA Med Center, and Johns Hopkins are using AI systems to develop patient cancer treatment plans and to improve accuracy in medical diagnosis. And it sounds good, but what happens when AI is based on incomplete data sets because a government orders their health service to remove the data of a certain race or a geographical area or members of a rival political party such that hospitals can't get complete data sets? What happens if the program is told to ignore data related to those suffering from a particular type of disease? Or what happens if a cost-cutting measure means that the AI no longer has access to the insurance company data from an earlier or a later period? So my belief is that it's very easy for us to end up back in the early phase of computing and the old acronym of GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. Why is Target here? Because Target is extremely excellent at data mining. And you've probably heard the story. I used it once as a sermon illustration. But that is, a man came into Target and he was furious because they had received mailers about baby products. And he said, my wife is in menopause and my daughter's a virgin, and there is no reason for you to be pelting us with all of this. The reality is the Target process was so much that they knew that there were certain products that people who were expecting tended to buy, and finding that pattern, they had sent it to that family's address because that family had been buying those things. This man was furious. The customer service agent apologized, and the man went home. And the next day, the man came back. At least he was honorable enough to come back. And he said, oh my, there were some things at my house I was unaware of. My daughter is expecting. Target knew before he did because of buying behavior. And that's what AI can do that can help marketeers market to certain people. But it could be really disorienting. And what if they made a mistake and all of a sudden they were sending stuff that led a spouse to think their spouse was having an affair? What if they sent stuff that that made somebody think that they had a problem? Like, for example, let's assume that you were a teetotaler and you were part of a teetotaling fellowship, and all of a sudden, all of these liquor advertisements started showing up. You might have a hard time explaining that. Or if, for example, you were doing a presentation on Zoom, and all of a sudden, some kinds of pornography pop-ups started coming up. You would have a hard time explaining that, and yet it might not be your fault at all. Although the last time a pornography pop-up showed up on my computer, it was on my computer at DePaul, and it was a result of following up a link that a student had given. What? Okay, but anyway, so that was the situation. So these are the kinds of things that might cause ethical issues in terms of AI. But next time, we're going to move into how can we apply biblical principles, and how can we encourage the inculcation of ethics into AI. because it isn't a matter of are we going to have AI? My goodness, we do.
Well, isn't the AI is put in by human beings?
Well, it started by human beings, but if it's self-corrected, then
Somebody has to program it, right?
yes, but you don't program it step by step. You program it to learn. If you're programming it, if you program the learning process, then it's grabbing the data and the information by itself.
But it depends on the data.
And now, so there are some basic algorithms for learning, and there are some desired outcomes, but there is a potential for it getting completely out of control. That's why there needs to be some kind of ethical approach, and that's where we're going to go next time.
中國好啱，你學習多近朱子石近墨石。即係如果你學得你個
Okay.
data set 係冇。
So I can't repeat what Dominic is saying because he's speaking it in Chinese. He's oh, so he was quoting the Chinese saying that if a child grows up next to some bad things, it's very likely to be bad. And say, yeah, if the data set is bad, you will create, bad results, and a bad AI that could be, running rampant.
I mean, it's the same with doctors, so that's why we have medical ethics. You can have bad doctors,
Yes.
So you have to regulate the doctors by the medical associations and so on and so forth, the same thing.
Right. But right now we don't have that for AI.
Yeah, we should have that.
And there needs to be, but some of these groups, like the transhuman group, they don't want any restrictions on it at all because they have an atheist manifesto. They want to be God. They don't want to pay attention to God. So we've got to find some way to be able to influence, without being shut out of the process.
Being trying to be God could turn out to be being trying to be the devil.
So Dominic said,